I am privileged to introduce to our speaker. You'll notice that I have Benjamin and not Ben. I only call him Ben when I slip up. I named him Benjamin for a reason, because one of my favorite preachers of years gone by was Benjamin Franklin. And the goatee, Benjamin Franklin had a goatee and he wore bow ties. So he fits right in. Now, I just wanted to say that the happiest years of my life was when I was able as a father to serve the congregation as an elder and have my son as a local preacher. Those were the most joyous years that I can think about. There are other joyful times, but not very many men get to be a father. Few get to be elders, and fewer than that we get to be an elder where your son is a local preacher. And then he took my little grandson and moved off. I just wanted to remind him of that. But now he gave me two, so he and Celine got together and gave me two. So anyway, his subject comes from Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Those who refuse to have God in their knowledge are corrupt in their hearts. And he's really going to cover more about evidences and so forth. But when you give God up or reject God, spiritually, nothing else is going to go right. And as Marion said, you're going to be unrighteous. And the unrighteous thinking and unrighteous acts are going to follow. America, and you can read, I want you to make sure you get a copy of the book. I think I have about 17 pages in my outline, or in my manuscript, and I did that because I knew other people would not give me 10, so I just used theirs. But I cover a little history. In early America, we worked at putting God in. And over the last few years, and it really started, I think, in the 60s, but it has grown, we are doing everything we can to remove God. So what does that say about rejecting God? If you remove God, it means you've rejected God. When you reject God, you're going downhill, not uphill. So as Benjamin directs our attention over the next few minutes, we'll just, again, we're going to have a song and then a prayer, and I believe that's right. And then Benjamin will just go preach.
Good evening. I'm glad to be able to be here with you tonight and to see familiar faces and a few new faces and to meet a few folks who I know people in common with. That's always fun when you go somewhere and meet people like that. I'm going to set my phone up here. Will you just trust me that I'm not texting during the sermon? I'm using it and it's got some of my slide information on there, and it's an easy way for me to do that. I'll try not to. If you see me post on Facebook at the timestamp, right about now, later tonight, you'll know that I was cheating. But my plan is just to look at it from time to time. As we look at Romans chapter 1, Romans chapter 1, we're going to begin, our verse of concern is verse 20, and I'm going to do my best to stay primarily in verse 20 while using just a small handful of other verses to address that. Romans chapter 1, just by way of summary of our verse, reads as follows. And apparently my transition is going to be a little slow, but they'll get there eventually. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. The "they are without excuse" is the big exclamation point at the end. He's making a moral point. You would like to be justified in the way that you're acting, but you can't. There isn't an excuse for this particular kind of behavior. But for him to get to the moral point, he starts with the God point, the point about God. Because morality doesn't stand on its own. You can't just make moral assertions and say, well, this is good and that's bad. And we see that sometimes. In fact, Actually, that's all we see. In our culture is assertions. The right and the left make these assertions about what's good and what's bad and what ought to be and what ought not to be. But without a grounding in a belief and a faith in God, all of those are just assertions, whether they're conservative assertions or liberal assertions or progressive assertions or centrist or populist assertions. They're just assertions unless they're rooted in who God is. There you can get to morality. There you can talk about right and wrong in a meaningful way. And that's where Paul is headed. He started out this conversation in verse 16, and Marion has given us some of the background to it already. But in this passage, he's been showing that the gospel is God's intervention in a story of colossal human failure. Romans chapter 1, by and large, even into chapter 2, is a story of human failure that goes back centuries. So just a little side note, Dad and I have a little disagreement on the story here. Dad says, if you read the Lectureship book, that the problem started in the 1960s. I think he's off by a little bit. I think it was the 1560s. Paul says, where it really got started? Adam. Adam's where your problem's at. So there's just a question of where you start, but the point is the same. There's this train wreck of human failures that goes back about as far as the eye can see. Really, we can find some horizons where we say, well, it was a little better here for a while, and it was a little better here for a while. But by and large, human failure is the story, and God has acted powerfully. The gospel is the power of God towards salvation. Salvation from what? That's a rescue word. God is having to rescue us because we've made a mess of it. And God has acted powerfully to intervene in this failure that we have created. The gospel has brought God back into view in the person of Jesus. The problem that we have to be rescued from is that we have divorced ourselves from God. We have removed God from our knowledge. Jesus brings God back into our knowledge. In Jesus, we see more of God than we've ever seen before. Israel knew more about God than anybody in their time, but in Jesus, we see more of God than even Israel knew. We see God in a new light that helps us to understand who He is. The sad human story then is caused by a turn from God, which sadly results in God's wrath and terrible consequences. The solution then, as Marion talked about in his lesson, is for humanity to find again what can be known about God. In verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. And I like that phrase, what can be known about God. There are some things that cannot be known about God. We have to be okay with that. God is sometimes mysterious, and apparently He likes it that way. There are some things, if God told us, we wouldn't understand it anyway. And I know because sometimes He tries, right? We read the Bible and we listen and we say, I think I got some of that. And sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's not so clear. There are some things that are not to be known about God. Mother's favorite verse to quote to us. When I asked Dad a Bible question growing up, Dad would give me an hour-long lecture, so I quickly learned I could ask Mom Bible questions and get shorter answers. But Mom would just say the same thing every time. She'd quote Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, dear. And that was her way of saying, I don't know. Okay. There are some things, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, by the way, is the rest of that verse. You never quoted that. There are some things that are hidden and that are secret, and that's okay. But there are some things that are known and that have to be known. That human life necessitates those things to be known to us. And when we forcibly exclude that knowledge from ourselves, nothing good can possibly come of it. And that's a story that's replayed itself many times in human history. So verse 20 is going to talk about what can be known about God. The first observation we want to make is that we need to think about ancient views of God. One of the hardest things in studying the Bible is to take yourself back in the time machine 2,000 years and not, it's fine for the Bible to speak to us today, it had better, but first it has to speak to them, and when we understand what it said to them, then we can take our turn and it can say something to us. So what were the ancient problems that Paul might have been referencing in some of these passages become apparent? One is idolatry, which was so prevalent in the ancient world. In the manuscript book, I reference Acts chapter 17 when Paul goes to Athens and calls it a city full of idols. And I don't know if we appreciate how ingrained into every aspect of Greek civil life was idolatry. And in every, not just the Greeks, all of them. This is what the Gentile world looked like. On every street corner was a god or a demigod who looked over that street corner, and every house was a household god who looked over that house. Every action was religious. There was no such thing as the secular world and the religious world. There was just the world. The butcher was a priest. I mean, the butcher who would sacrifice the cattle would say, in the name of Zeus, right, and sacrifice the cattle as he butchered. I mean, everything was involved in that way of thinking and way of life in every aspect of their culture. And they have these idols everywhere. And even in Greek culture, Athens stood out as a place which had even more, and Rome was the same kind of place. And these were these visible representations of the gods. Who is your God? It was right over there. That's what he looks like. And you understand where it comes from. The ancient world was desperately looking for some explanation for things. They believe there needs to be a God. In that sense, they're smarter than some of us. They're quite positive there's a God. But instead of looking at what we're going to talk about today, they just kind of looked around and said, how about that over there? That could be a God. And that's where the problem comes from. So the gods have visible representations in the ancient world. Everywhere you turn is some visible representation of God. Their philosophers, though, were quite the opposite. The Epicureans at this time were not at all convinced in what the normal folk, oh, you foolish Greek and Romans, you believe in your idols. We're way smarter than that. We believe in gods, we Epicureans. They're way off in Godville. Wherever the gods live, not even Olympus is high enough. Wherever they live off yonder, and what do? They do God stuff. They don't care about us. They're not interested in us. They have nothing to do with us. And so our job is to just get on with life down here in this material world and not worry about the gods. Because if they're real, they are so far removed from everyday life that you shouldn't care. So those two views are going on at the same time in the world to which Paul is preaching. And what does Paul claim? The opposite of both views. He says, number one, God is invisible. These idols just aren't going to cut it. This is one of the most basic claims of the Old Testament all the way through, repeated time and time again. At great lengths, whether it's the Ten Commandments or elsewhere, God says, you're not going to represent God visibly. That can't be done. I'll give you my favorite example of this is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is this grand little box, and it has inside of it these things that represent the Jewish religion. It's very important. But on top of the box is this fantastic lid. So you have this box that sits on the ground like a pedestal when it's in place. And at the top is this beautifully ornate lid. And on the lid are these two angels, and I can't remember if they're seraph or cherub. I think it's seraphim. Anyway, they're bowed down, facing the center of the box. Okay, the wings outstretched. This is an idol stand. If you were to see this in the ancient world, you would say, I know what that is. That is an idol stand. And what you were supposed to do is put your idol in between the two bowing angels. The two angels are worshiping the idol that sits in the middle. And you know what was in the middle of the Ark of the Covenant? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Empty space called the mercy seat. And it sat in the middle of the temple or in the tabernacle, and that's where the voice of God emanated from that spoke to the high priest, from the mercy seat, from empty space. I mean, quite literally, to get his point across, God says, I want you to build me an idol stand, but there's not going to be any idol there. I'm going to speak from the empty space in the middle. I mean, just through so many graphic representations, he says to them, God is invisible, and you're just not going to see me that way. It can't ever be that way. So Paul's claim is, there are the invisible things of God. But then his other claim is that God is near to us and clearly seen. These seem contradictory, and I know that. We're going to get to it. They seem contradictory. Paul, that sounds like cheating. He's very obviously invisible, right? You can see very clearly that you can't see him. It seems to be a troublesome statement even for Paul. Well, that's exactly what he says. There are invisible attributes of God, but they are clearly seen at the same time. So, unlike the idolaters, God is invisible. Unlike the Epicureans, God's not distant and foreign to us. There are some things that are plainly known about God, and we need to come to grips with those. First of all, in this passage, let me just look at it again. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature. What does he mean by these two attributes? So he names them for you. When I got started on this lesson, I'll admit, it said God's attributes, and so I thought, well, I'm just going to start writing down attributes of God. And I thought, well, that's not fair, because Paul actually names what he's talking about. It's not just any old attribute. Well, there's plenty of them. He says the attributes, these attributes. First of all, what is called his eternal power. God is an active reality, not a distant fiction. Every ancient notion of God worked really hard to explain why God didn't do anything. Read the ancient religions, they were off fighting wars in the heavens, and they were doing other, or maybe you just haven't done the ritual right, and so they invented elaborate rituals to persuade the gods to do things they wanted. A good example of this is at Mount Carmel. You remember where Elijah the prophet challenges the prophets, and he says, you have Baal, the god of thunder and fire and whatnot. You have him call down fire and consume the sacrifice. And so what do? Well, they've got to get his attention, because got news for you, Baal doesn't really do things on demand, and so they've got to get his attention, and there's dancing and hooping and hollering and cutting. Applaud their commitment for a moment. They're cutting themselves, doing themselves harm, doing terrible things, trying to get their God's attention. Does anybody remember what Elijah says about all of that? It's one of my favorite little quotes. The ESV has it really well. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. Elijah wasn't very nice, but that's okay. Elijah says, your God isn't doing anything. In the Hebrew there, quite literally, maybe he's using the restroom. Maybe you've caught him indisposed. Elijah, not nice at all. And what was the point? You've got to come up with some excuse for why your God isn't doing anything. He's not listening. And that was the ancient conception of God that they came to get used to. Because the gods never did anything, not anything helpful. Well, they'd strike somebody dead once in a while, and you'd blame it on the gods, but never anything useful. Israel made a very different claim about God. Their God was active and real, and they actually expected him to do things in the life of Israel's history. Just let me read for you a moment from Psalm 115, verses 2 through 8. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. The psalmist wasn't very nice either, come to think of it. Why does he say, our God is in the heaven? Now watch what he says next. This is very careful. Okay? Our God is in the heaven. Oh, he's not one of these distant gods that doesn't care about it. No. Our God is in the heavens, but he does all that he pleases. Or to quote another of the old Psalms, heaven is his throne, but earth is his footstool. He's not removed from us. He's not distant. He's very near. He's as close as he cares to be. And he does whatever it is he wants. Your God, on the other hand, does absolutely nothing, ever. Got a mouth, can't speak. Got eyes, can't see. Quite literally, if you want to move your God from one end of the temple to the other, somebody's got to get a wheelbarrow. That's how impotent and useless your God is, and you're starting to look like him. Because worshiping an impotent God makes you equally powerless. Israel said, that's not the God we worship. And so the first claim that Paul makes is that one of his invisible attributes that we clearly perceive, one of those things we keep running into, is that he is active. He's powerful. Both of those things are together. Let me put those together very carefully. He's not just powerful, and he's not just active. He's powerfully active. It would be one thing if he was very powerful and never did anything. It would be one thing if he was really meddlesome and doing something all the time but didn't have any power to be effective. The God of Israel is active and powerful, and they expected to see him. If you read the Old Testament, it just filled with stories where they just keep running into God doing something. Abraham meets him at Mamre. Jacob meets him at the ford of Jabbok. Israel meets him at Sinai. And there he is in all his fury. And it's terrifying. The Hebrew text there in that Sinai text says, and Israel took its stand before the mountain. It's Alamo language. There came God. None of the gods of Egypt had ever showed up before. But there comes the God of the Exodus, and he's on the top of that mountain, and he's terrifying. And so the elders do what elders do, and they said, "Preacher, you go up." And they sent Moses up to the top of the mountain because nobody wanted to actually meet him. But it was terrifying. They took their stand at the bottom of the mountain. This was a God that showed up from time to time, and he did things. He was actually expected to be in their presence. The tabernacle was a tent that was designed. We have ancient Egyptian tents that are very much like this that Pharaoh would travel in. And Pharaoh, God on earth, right, would travel in these magnificent tents that would sit in the middle of the camp, and then all the troops and the entourage would camp out around him. The tabernacle looks very similar, only there isn't any king in the middle. There's that throne, there's that seat, that idol stand with no idol. And a voice speaks out of that tent. God spoke. Sometimes he spoke angrily. Sometimes he spoke words of hospitality and kindness, but he spoke, and they expected that. So the first claim that Paul makes is that God is and has eternal power, that he is active, that he is near, and that he is to be expected. Heaven may be his throne, but earth is his footstool. Second claim that Paul makes, his second invisible attribute that we need to perceive, first his eternal power and then his divine nature. And what I think is being described here is that God is also a person. So think again about ancient religions. And we have modern religions that do the same thing. Pantheists believed that, oh, sure, we believe in God. Everything's God, and God is everything. God's that bench, God's that chair, God's the air you breathe, God's you, God's me. They have a real problem with the problem of evil, because that means God is cancer, and God is death, and God is terrible things, and they don't know what to do about that. But we still have pantheists who will think of God as a force in the universe at work, or even to deify the universe itself. I'll just give you a pop culture example for a moment, just to make my point. A show that was on for several seasons, How I Met Your Mother, interesting comedy sitcom. Okay, we're not discussing the virtues of it, but what we are going to say, that the theme line of the story was, there's this fellow named Ted, and the universe wanted him to find the right person to marry. And through the series of events that unfolded, there'd be some colossal failure in some episode, and somebody would say, "Ted, don't you get it? It's the universe telling you that this is the one." Well, what are we doing there? We're treating the universe as if it's this force at work, and its end goal, surprise, is my happiness. If the universe wants to be romantically happy, isn't that great? And we turn the universe into this being, but not really a being, this force. It's another version of kind of pop culture pantheism that treats the universe as a power at work in control of our lives. Ancient Platonists had the same issue. This is in a different form. Plato believed, there's material things down here, but this isn't the real stuff. The real stuff is ideas. Ideas are what really matter. That's not a chair you're sitting in. That's just a kind of a chair. There is, in the world of ideas, a perfect chair. And those ideas are what really matters. And the universe is constructed and built around perfect ideas. And Greek philosophers thought this was great stuff, right? Great, perfect ideas. Paul says, well, that's nice, but no. The God we're looking for is not merely an idea. He is not an abstract force. He is a divine nature. He is, in fact, a person. And this was really a problem for the Greek philosophers, who had been idolaters for centuries. And finally, in the first century, we know from Greek records, they're finally turning the corner, and the philosophers are saying, maybe we need to get rid of idols. Maybe God isn't a person like that. And so Paul comes and says, yes, get rid of the idols, but God's still a person. And they just kind of slap their foreheads and say, well, I thought we were past that. That's old ancient superstition about Zeus and all the... No, God's not a God like Zeus, but God does have a divine nature. He is a person, a God, the God, in fact, the only God, and must be viewed in this way. Paul's claim is that God is a person, not a force or idea, and that his primary attributes are moral. So that's the difference between a person and a thing. The universe doesn't care. Rocks can't do evil. Matter can't do good. Gravity isn't malicious. Gravity isn't kind. Gravity just does what it does. which is why, as I said a moment ago, the pantheist has a real problem with evil in the world, because that means God is the evil things too. That's fine, because there really isn't any evil. There's just what is. Paul says, no, that's not the way it works. There is actually a person that we're supposed to know. An actual person. Not a human person. Not a humanized person. Zeus was a womanizer. All the gods had problems. He said, no, not that. Not that kind of person. But actually a person, yes, that you should know. And his attributes are moral. I can't attribute evil or good to the universe, but we do to God. Listen to the most important of, maybe the most important, okay, for the purpose of my lesson, the most important description of God coming from Exodus 34, 6 through 7. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. You hear how absurd that description of God is? If God is this kind of this immaterial force, if God is just this reality, if He's just the universe working its will, not a person, just this thing out there, there's just something out there that doesn't care about you, not a person. If that's what God is to you, then this description's silly. Forgiving? Rocks can't forgive me. Gracious? Matter can't be gracious. A mountain isn't nice to me. It just is a mountain. It's what it is. God is gracious. God is forgiving. God is just and imputes sin, or imputes the consequence of sin. These are all things that people do. We're told to be grateful to God. I had a wonderful conversation with a young lady who grew up in churches and ended up later in life more or less an atheist as much as she wanted to be. And we were talking about, does that make any sense? And one of the things she just kept saying, I guess somebody had told her this, that I feel gratitude. I feel grateful for the things I have. I don't need religion to be a grateful person. And every time she'd bring it up, I'd say, grateful to who? I can't be grateful to a thing. That's a personal quality. I can be grateful for someone who has acted and made a choice. I can't be grateful to a force of nature. I'm not grateful to gravity. Gravity doesn't care. It pulls me down and keeps me from flying off the earth, and it doesn't care if it breaks my neck if I fall off a building. It doesn't care about me one way or the other. It does me great good one day, great harm the next. It just doesn't care. I can't be grateful to forces of nature, but I can be grateful to God. God is a person and is called on us to treat him in this way. Great quote I love. It's a little dense, but it comes from the late Cardinal Newman. He says, inanimate things cannot stir our affections. Those are correlative with persons. These feelings in us are such as require for their exciting cause an intelligent being. We are not affectionate towards a stone, nor do we feel shame before a horse or a dog. The wicked flees when no man pursueth. That's Proverbs 28:1. Then why does he flee? Whence his terror? Who is it that he sees in solitude, in darkness, in the hidden chambers of his heart? If the cause of these emotions does not belong to this visible world, the object to which this perception is directed must be supernatural and divine. And thus the phenomena of conscience, as a dictate, avail to oppress the imagination with a picture of a supreme governor, a judge, holy, just, powerful, all-seeing, retributive, and is the creative principle of religion, as the moral sense is the principle of ethics. What he's trying to say there is, every human experiences this. You feel shame when you do bad. You feel proud when you do good. You feel grateful when good things happen. And I'll go a step further. You feel angry when bad things happen. You want to blame somebody. Those are personal responses. And Paul says, yes, exactly. Because they're a person. There is a person that we're looking for. There is a person that we have to come to know. And he is embedded on the human life and heart. That we're looking for this person. Which is why we personify everything else. We'll take a piece of stone. Now, they didn't just worship stone, did they? They carved it to look like a person. Why? Because there's this pursuit. We're looking for someone to be grateful. Someone to make us feel shame and explain why we feel bad. Someone to blame when the crops don't come in. We're looking for a person. Paul says there is a person. You just haven't met him yet. God is a divine nature. He is a person who wants to be known, in the imitation of which all human persons are made. This stands against the belief in the impersonal gods that are identical with natural forces. And Paul believes that these two invisible attributes of God are not only true, but are also clearly seen. So 30 minutes in, I'm going to get to the second half of my lesson. That's a bad sign. But the point we want to make now is that he wants to tell us that they are clearly seen by the things that are made. I think there's a little translation problem here, and I asked a couple of my favorite Greek gurus if they could sort it out, and I had two guys who were equally convinced on both sides. What is it you like to say, Marion? I have friends on both sides of the issue, and I always agree with my friends, and that's kind of what I felt about this. There were two very strong opinions. But anyway, in the passage it says that in verse 20, they are clearly seen by ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. The Greek verb could easily be rendered by the things that have been done. And I think that might be better. And the reason I say that is he's not just talking about objects. Now, once in a while in the Bible, it'll hold up an object and say, look at that. Isn't that great? God made that. So, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. Psalm 19, 1 and following. Once in a while it says, look at the things God has made. I am fearfully and wonderfully made, the psalmist said. Once in a while, look at a thing God has made. But more often, if you read especially the Psalms, the point that the Bible makes is we know who God is because of the things he has done, which includes the things that he's made, but even more than that, the things he's kept on doing. On day 7, do we understand this? On day 7, God rested. He stopped that particular effort. He didn't actually take a nap. And I think sometimes we believe that ever since day 7, God has been napping somewhere in heaven, and he might wake up come Judgment Day and do something about it. And that's not the story. That's not how it goes, right? God is not actually stopped. Israel has been saying all along, every time we turn around, God is doing something. Can I read a passage to you? I'm asking just to be polite. I'm going to read it whether you say yes or no. Psalm 136 is a lengthy passage. I won't make you do it the way Israel did it. I think Psalm 136 was a speech and response psalm because it has this line, the steadfast love endures forever, and it repeats every verse. And so what I think happened is the guy reading the psalm would read the first part, and then the audience would say, or a steadfast love endures forever. But, I didn't know if we wanted to do all that. So we're just going to read it if that's okay. But you can hear the sing-song in it as we read through it. This is Psalm 136. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. Well, how come? Well, first he's going to set out some creation things. Here are some things that God has made that you can see. To him who alone does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him by understanding made the heavens, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who made the great lights, for his steadfast love endures forever. To the sun to rule over the day, for his steadfast love endures forever. The moon and stars to rule over the night, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now watch, transitions seamlessly out of the creation week and into the history of Israel. They didn't think of it as, oh great, God's done, he went to sleep. They said, and then he kept on doing. To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, his steadfast love endures forever, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea in two, for his steadfast love endures forever, and made Israel pass through the midst of it, for his steadfast love endures forever, but overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who led his people through his wilderness, for his steadfast love endures forever. Oh, well, the Exodus, that was interesting, but he's not done. How about the whole rest of Israel's history? To him who struck down great kings, for his steadfast love endures forever, and killed mighty kings, for his steadfast love endures forever. Sihon, king of the Amorites, for his steadfast love endures forever. And Og, the king of Bashan, for his steadfast love endures forever. And gave their land as a heritage, for his steadfast love endures forever. A heritage to Israel his servant, for his steadfast love endures forever. It is he who remembered us in our low estate, for his steadfast love endures forever, and rescued us from our foes, for his steadfast love endures forever. He who gives food to all flesh, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of heaven, for his steadfast love endures forever. Where did it stop? See, Israel didn't think of it as, well, God did something once and then left us alone. He started the top spinning and then let it be. For Israel, they said, God has always been doing something. All the way up to the last. What's the last one? He says he gives us food. Now, wait a second, that's not how it worked. I went down to here on the farm and I did the work. They said, no, God did that. You read the scriptures, and consistently, that's what the scriptures tell us. If it's good in this world, God's doing it. He makes his sun to rise on the just and on the unjust. Makes, present tense. Who makes the sun rise? Even today. If it comes up in the morning, God did it. That's the way it works. God is continually active. He is continually doing. And the problem for us is that so much is being done by him, we have trained ourselves to ignore it. It's actually not an insufficient amount of evidence. It's an overwhelming mudslide of evidence, an avalanche of evidence. It is so overwhelming that we get caught up in it and we don't notice. We don't notice the goodness in this world. We don't notice that every breath. What does Hebrews say? Hebrews chapter 1, verse 4. Maybe I should pay attention to my notes, then I'd know that. Talks verse 3, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Sustaining, present tense. At this very moment, the universe exists because God is still making it to exist. This is actually one of the great scandals of the cross, if you'll think about it for just a moment. This is a little off the topic, but Marion said I can go as long as I want, so it's okay. The cross of Christ, there was a man named Jesus Christ who was also God. And on that cross were nails that held him to that cross. And the force of gravity pulled his body down against the nails. Have we stopped to ponder that the only reason the cross existed and that the nails existed and that gravity worked was because the man that they were inflicting pain on willed it to continue? He was at that moment sustaining the entirety of the universe that was killing him. He was holding together the nails that held him to the cross. And that's the teaching of the New Testament. That God at every moment is causing this world to be. Every morning making the sun to rise. Jesus talks about gender. He says, he which made them at the beginning made the male and female. And he still does. I mean, he still, every birth is a work of God. He still believes that. So when we think about this, what does Paul mean when he says it's clearly seen? He says you can't get around it. In fact, there's so much of it that we've just learned to ignore it. We've learned to turn it off. David Foster Wallace gave a famous speech at Kenyon College where he talked about, it's called This is Water. And he described some fish in a bowl. And two young fish are swimming by, and the old fish swims by and says, boy, isn't this water is great? And the two young fish say, what's water? When you're surrounded by it, you just kind of forget that it's there, right? And that's the problem with God. His goodness is there even when we deny it. You can say, I don't believe in God, and if he's real, I hate him. You can say that if you want, and you still get to breathe. He's nice like that. He's gracious. He doesn't take the air from your breath and your lungs. He sustains it, even while we blaspheme him. This is the graciousness of God, and it's ever present, leaving us then without excuse. Let me kind of move on and get home here where we can get to our point. Skipping that one. Skipping that one. You have to read the book, see? Skipping that one. Creation then makes on us three demands when Paul says that we are without excuse. First one is a demand of truth. There is something about the world that we have to know. There's no way not to know it. There's no rational or irrational way to deny it. You exist. You're here. There's something going on with you. The story is told of the philosophy major who had the existential crisis and one night stayed up all night and was concerned that maybe he couldn't prove he really exists. And all night he read through all the great philosophical works and read the textbooks and came in the next day to the professor and says, "You've ruined my life. I don't know if I exist anymore. I've read Aristotle and I've read Plato and I can't prove if I exist. Professor, do I exist?" And the professor says, "Who's asking?" Reality is you're here, right? I mean, you exist. You're here. You're a person. And as soon as you ask the question, you're done. Okay? That's it. There are some things you got to know. Bertrand Russell was the famous atheist who was asked one time, if someday you do find out there is a God and you appear before the judgment seat, what will you say to God that you've never believed in? He said, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." Not enough evidence for what? Not enough evidence for coercion. I mean, yeah, God never intended to pile such amount of evidence that you no longer have free will to compel you to believe in Him. That was Charlemagne's approach. Charlemagne was the greatest baptizer in all of human history. He had a great program. He conquered a nation and he said, "You're going to be baptized or we're going to cut your head off." He had a lot of converts. But it turns out that was not the plan that God thought was going to work. He wants converts, not conquests. And He wants to persuade. He doesn't want to coerce us. And so there is plenty enough evidence, but not for coercion. Is there enough evidence if you exclude some of it? Well, this is always fun, right? If you start out the discussion by saying, "Well, I'm not going to count any of that religious stuff," try that sometime. I'm going to study art, but I don't actually want to see any paintings. So I'm going to do math, but I don't want to use any numbers. I want to study history, but I don't want, things that happen. And that doesn't work that way. If you're going to study, you got to study everything. You got to keep it open. You're a chemist and I want to study barium, but first I'm going to throw out all the samples of barium. Well, you're going to have a problem with that. And that's what a lot of folks do when they approach God. They say, "There's not enough evidence." What do you mean? Well, if I throw out all the miracles and I throw out all the Bible and I throw out all the things that you say about the world that I live in and its goodness and its kindness and its graciousness, if I throw out the morality and the sense of morality that I feel even when I deny it, when I throw all of that out, I just don't believe in God anymore. And I say, "Well, yeah, I imagine not." I don't think that's what Paul was saying. Paul wasn't saying that you couldn't come up with an excuse. It is that you didn't have a good one. The evidence is, in fact, overwhelming if we use all the things that humans have at our disposal. Our experience, our intellect, our compassion, our sense of morality, our sense that we exist, our sense of gratitude. We start looking at these things, and maybe any one of them you could dodge. If you're really clever, you could say, "Well, I found a way around that one." When you put them together, there is this symphony, a chorus. It is creation singing its maker's praise. And you really got to plug your ears not to hear it. So there's a mandate of truth. Second, there's a mandate of morality. If God is the God that Paul says that He is, He's a moral being. He's a person. Great story in Exodus. Moses says, "I want to see God." God says, "Well, that's not going to work." Paraphrasing, of course. That's not going to work out. He says, "I want to see your glory." So God finally says, "Well, I'll let you see some." But He doesn't say glory. If you read the text carefully, and this is in the book, Moses says, "I want to see your glory." And God says, "I will make my goodness pass in front of you." When you think about the glory of God, I think about awesome power, thunderstorms and lightning. God says, "You want to see glory? It is the moral goodness of God." God's a moral being. Come to know that God has a moral responsibility. It means there's a way that I have to live. There's an oughtness to human life that I have to recognize because I am made by a moral being to be moral. And try as I might, I can't undo that. I can deny it. I can come up with all sort of inventive excuses to avoid it. I can fill my life with distractions and ignore every element of what God has put in me, but it's there. There's a moral component to creation that has to be observed. And finally, there is a spiritual mandate of creation. You don't belong to yourself. And what you see and perceive in this limited little worldview that we have called naturalism that has boiled everything down to nuts and bolts and atoms and forces has excluded from the world something God has put here. There's a parable told, it's not a parable of Jesus, it's a more modern one, of a nation that had a great river that ran through the middle of it and it flooded every so often. People got tired of it flooding it, so they had a great solution: concrete. We're going to concrete every square inch of the river. We're going to concrete every fountain. We're going to concrete every riverbed. We're going to concrete every pond. We're going to put cement on everything. Desert of cement. You know, they were thirsty after that, it turns out. Time passed. What do you think happens to a world of concrete? There's something underneath that's supposed to be coming up. And when it does, it's violent and unpleasant because it was never supposed to be kept down. I think that's a real good description of the world we live in. For centuries now, we've been working really hard at suppressing the knowledge of God. We can get there without God. We can have government without God. We can have morality without God. And we're working really hard at it. And it turns out you just keep pushing the spiritual reality of this world down, and it starts popping up. It starts popping up in violent ways. Can I make an observation? Again, just saying that to be nice, I'm going to make it anyway. What about radical violent Islam? You know, there are people of great passion about their beliefs, have considerable convictions. They think something is very wrong with the world. By the way, they think it's you. They look at America and they see a land of concrete. They see a land that has suppressed knowledge of what should be going on in the world, your consumerism and your riches and your goods and your vile affections, and they say, that can't be the way it is, and up comes spirituality, but it's not good. It's breaking through concrete, and it's violent, and it's unpleasant, because it was never supposed to be put down. When we see radical reactions in religion, usually it's because someone was trying to eradicate religion. And it's a violent overreaction on the other side. Islam believes in the holiness of God. They believe in the holiness of God so much they'll kill you if you think otherwise. See what happened there? This is a problem. We've suppressed something that was never supposed to be suppressed. We have silenced something that was never supposed to be silenced. We are a creature that is made to run on God. We are made in His image and part of His creation which sings His praise, and we aren't supposed to exist without Him. We have made ourselves schizophrenic by cutting Him out of who we are. And it just can't possibly work. And that's the spiritual mandate of all creation. The Christian's job then is to ignore the next 3 slides. Just a moment, getting there. I might have overestimated how long I had to say what I had to say. The Christian's responsibility then is to reaffirm the basic convictions that Paul has stated here in a world of dismal morality, and it's been that way since Adam, in a world of suppressed spirituality, and it's been that way of Adam, in a world that is denying the truth of God Himself, and it's been that way since Adam. We have to affirm that God's nature is one of both great power and personal morality. God's nature is woven into every facet of human existence if we will but look. We must affirm that God's nature and works make demands of us which we cannot ignore without grave consequences to self and to the world that we live in. And we must affirm that the denial of God is the problem to which the gospel is heaven's response. This is not a new problem. Romans says this is an Adam problem to which a righteous man has responded in the person of Jesus Christ. We, in the imitation of Adam, have repeated his rebellion. And in Jesus, God has said, look here at what can be known of God, and shown us Himself in a way we've never seen Him before. If you would turn to Christ Jesus and to the God shown in Him, in faith and obedience, we're going to stand and sing a word of invitation. If there's anything we can do to assist you, won't you come at this time?